Howdy ho there, neighbors. Hope everyone's well, and life is treating you well. Now, I am going to be doing another Gazetteer review, because apparently they released it. I did not, when I did my last Gazetteer review, I expected that I would not be doing any more because they they hadn't released all of them to the PDF stores. Used to be D&D Classics. Now they just put it all under the Dungeon Masters Guild sort of overall thing. And I'll talk about the Dungeon Masters Guild thing at another point. It's not really relevant to this discussion. But anyways, they released the new one, another one, and I didn't expect them to anytime soon, so I was afraid I was going to have to try and track it down in print, and that would have taken me a long time. So I was expecting that it would be something that it would take me a while to grab. It turns out they released it. That's nice of them, I think. And this is the last of the Gazetteers. It's not the last Gazetteer I'll be talking about, because there's still one left that they did not cover. It's a big one. It's the box set, Dawn of the Emperors. But this is the last one that they actually printed of, that TSR printed for the known world setting. They would cover more stuff in the known world setting with adventures and occasional dragon articles. But Gaz 14, the Atruaghin Clan, or Elk Clans, I suppose is the correct pronunciation, is the last one that they released in the Gazetteer line. It was written by a William Connors, who actually wrote a lot of the Ravenloft stuff. And he wrote a lot for TSR back in the day in general. So, he definitely was one of the guys who did a lot of material for them. So, it might be worth checking out some of his other stuff. Now, as to the basis on this one, each of the Gazetteers had sort of a, I don't know, not necessarily a real-world cultural analog, but at least it could call upon some cultural analogs that people would recognize. Whether it is, Italian city-states or Russian sort of boyar culture or Roman legions or, the Arabian cultures and so on. They all had sort of their own real-world tie-ins as far as the human cultures anyway. The real-world tie-in on this one is interesting, and it bears talking about before I get too far into the Gazetteer. So, there is a lot of talk about finding that balance between cultural appropriation and finding good representation. So, you don't want every culture that you see in a sort of fantasy world to be based off Western Europe. But when you start straying outside of Western European cultures, you run the risk of being sort of insulting by just taking portions and not really fairly representing them. So a lot of people fear actually getting into the non-Western European settings because they're, on some level, they're afraid they'll get it wrong. And people will call them on it. And it's much easier to just go with the thing that everybody's familiar with. Everyone's read King Arthur, and if you write a culture that's sort of based on that version of legends and myths, it's hard to go wrong. But that also means that you don't see a lot of representation of other cultures. The Atruaghin Clans is one of the few examples I've seen, not the only one, but certainly one of the few examples I've seen of trying to put Native American cultures into a fantasy setting. And for the most part, I find that it's not bad at it. it does some generalizations, but it doesn't do it in the same way that you might expect. It doesn't do it in a way that is intended to insult or belittle. It is more, these are the different clans, and they represent sort of a broad grouping of different types of Native American tribes in that regard. There is the Elk Clan, and they are more on line of the East Coast Native American tribes, the Cherokee, all the way up to the northern tribes that, actually the early U.S. learned a lot, that early Americans, before they broke away, learned a lot about how to set up a fairly democratic government up in New York State from the natives that were here. They have the Clan of the Horse, which is clearly intended to represent the sort of horse riding tribes, not unlike the Lakota Sioux or something like that. They have the Turtle Clan, which are largely based off the northeastern or northwestern tribes up in the Seattle, Portland area of modern day world, and they're like the Salish or what have you. You've got the Bear Clan, which represents the sort of desert Southwest clans, specifically more along the lines of the Pueblo and the Hopi and those people. And then you have another clan that is loosely based off of Aztecs. And this is probably the most problematic. They're the Clan of the Tigers, and I'll get into them in a bit. But they are, in some ways, the most problematic of the one representations that they show, because it is almost completely made up of the negative stereotypes about the native tribes that are from the southern end of North America. But I'll get in that for a second. First off, it's split up into 2 books, like most of them. It's a standard format at that point. But in this case, the players section is actually larger than the game master section, which I actually appreciate. I think that the players should have a stronger understanding of the world they come from, I guess. So I appreciated that. The basic story of the Atruaghin Clans is back in the time of Blackmore, when the Rain of Fire, the Axis gets shifted, great disaster. There were several cultures in the world, and one of them was the Ultec, and they had a more sort of violent splinter version called the Azcan. Now these become important to the Hollow World setting, because they're the ones that end up going to the Hollow World for the most part. But the ones that get left on the surface, end up in different places, but a large portion of them end up in the sort of plateau region in the southwestern portion of the Gnome World setting. They actually have a section set aside where they talk about, hey, we told you about this section in a previous Gazetteer. What we told you there was wrong. This was what, somebody had written about it in world and was completely false and had nothing to do with what was going on there. So please ignore that section. So this is, clearly a section that they, changed their mind on what they were doing with this particular section of the country. Anyways, this culture is there. They get united at one point. The person who unites them becomes an immortal, which is fairly common theme in the Gnome World. If this is your first Gazetteer, you may not know this. Mystara didn't have gods per se. All of their gods were actually immortals, which were, they started out as ordinary people, and they rose in power and grew more powerful until they become god-like status, and they gain power from gaining followers, and it was a thing in basic D&D. The tail end of the campaign tree was the Immortals, and they were, it was a new way to play, really. And so they had one that did this and united them, and then they fell back apart because things like that happen. This guy did it by strength. But then after him came another fellow, this one from within the Hollow World, named Atruaghin. I'm guessing at that pronunciation. They don't give you a whole lot of pronunciation guides, so if I'm pronouncing it wrong, please forgive me. The Atruaghin was basically a really powerful guy from the Hollow World that was running away from Atzamaltal, I think is how it's pronounced. He got mentioned in one of the previous Gazetteer reviews that I did on the Shadow Clan, or the Shadow Elves. He's an evil god that's found in the Hollow World. He overtook Atruaghin's people in there, made them hunt him down, and he eventually fled to the surface world, found all these guys living on living out in the plains, and thought, okay, well, I'll help these guys out. And he showed them how to be peaceful and how to, have a respect for nature and, good, helpful, we're a good guy kind of thing. And then said, hey, I'm going to put these guys in charge. And when I come, I'll be back someday. Well, while he was away, and I'll get into where he was in a bit, while he was away, the lands were invaded by the Red Orcs. I'm not sure if it was a deliberate choice to call it the Red Orcs, but we'll let that one stand. And they were oppressed for a couple of centuries, and then Atruaghin came back and found them and organized resistance, and they drove the orcs out, and then he called on all his magic and all his spells and a few immortals, and rose an entire huge plateau even further into the air, so that they could never be invaded again. You come up to the plateau where the Atruaghin clans live, and it's not a gentle slope up to the thing. You've got to take an elevator to get up there. So it would be really hard for an army to invade. So he basically isolated them. And so they didn't have a lot of trade with other nations for a long time. And that's sort of given us the explanation for why they are, in some ways, considered more primitive. They make a key distinction in the text, and I'm glad they do. They aren't actually primitive. The notion that you have primitive cultures and civilized cultures is kind of insulting, and it doesn't really reflect the sort of broad, complex intermix of realities. They are a society that is not as interrelated to the rest of the world, though. So some of the technologies that the rest of the world use, they don't have, because they just never traded for them until much more recently. They didn't have metalworking for a large portion of the people who lived there. They didn't need it, not to live the way they wanted to live. So, they didn't have that. One of the clans does work metal, and that is the Tiger Clan. It is not coincidental that they are also the sort of evil clan. So, let's talk about the clans, because it does break it up into the clans. After giving you a section on making characters, and it gives you skills, introducing you to a couple of new skills. Interestingly, it doesn't actually give you the rules for the skills. It's like, you can find the rules for skills in these books. You should go check them out. But here are the skills that we're introducing. They also introduce a class called Shamani, which are basically a cleric progression with a few minor differences. they introduce totems. You are supposed to pick basically a spirit animal. And that spirit animal, you gain advantage when dealing with those spirit animals. You have problems if you end up killing an animal that is your spirit animal. So it's a complex mix. You get advantages from having different ones available to you. The rules are not super clear and precise, but they give you a broad sort of, this is how you handle this. And then they get into the section where they describe the individual clans. Now, the individual clans are interesting because they do represent those iconic North American, native Aboriginal tribes. The Horse Clan is very warlike in some regards. They ride horses, obviously. They use spears and tomahawks. And while they use bows, they don't use them in warfare. It actually specifies that if you're a member of that tribe and you use a bow in combat, even if other people in the combat are using melee weapons, you don't get experience points. And there are a few rules like this in the book. The Tiger Clan, let me see if I can read this, because I saved this because I thought, okay, this is interesting. If you die in a noble fashion in Tiger Clan territory, and that they revere death, and the more awesome you are in dying, the more they respect you. If you die in Tiger Clan territory, the book actually gives you rules for what to do next. Players whose characters die in this way are rewarded as well. When they create a character to replace the one that has been lost, the new character begins at a level higher than the first. To determine the starting level of the character, roll 1d4 plus 1. The character receives the minimum experience awarded required for that level. No earned experience bonus is applied, and the character's starting cash is multiplied by his level. The book has these kinds of rules in it, and I'm both fascinated by it and sort of vaguely horrified. This is a terrible idea, but it's a terrible idea from a time when D&D was very different. But yeah, so you've got the Horse Clan, they're warlike. You've got the Bear Clan, which are living in the side of cliffs, strongly tied to Atruaghin as their religious ties, and they do a snake dance, which is sort of like a rain dance, I guess, in some regards. You've got the Turtle Clan, which are very much about fishing, and they go out on their canoes and do these whale hunts, which is very cool. They do totem poles and things like that. The clan of the Elk, very much in the line of Cherokee, and the other sort of big tribes of the eastern North America. They have long houses, and they're very agrarian, not as nomadic. And you've got your Tiger Clan, and the Tiger Clan are super warlike, ruled by insane high priests who are chaotic, and they demand shows of loyalty and death, and they do blood sacrifices, and they don't actually follow Atruaghin anymore. They may have followed him at one time, but that evil god Xanatal actually got a hold of them at one point and sort of converted them all to his way of thinking. So you end up with blood cults and things like that. And, that's roughly the arc of the material that they cover in the player's guide. Now, the GM's guide is shorter. It does have a great deal more information about Immortals than just about any of the Gazetteers before it. It gives sort of, this is what this Immortal is, and their personality, and their spheres, what spheres they influence, what their rank is, and it has several of these Immortals, and these Immortals don't generally interact with the rest of the Immortals in the known world. They are somewhat segregated, like their people are, and that's interesting as well. But it gives some stats for the Immortals. One of the mid to high grade Immortal might have what in modern D&D would be roughly a 30 AC, and be able to attack 5 times a turn, and just all kinds of weird, super high stats that they wouldn't have had. We wouldn't have even bothered doing that in 5th edition as far as here's what the gods have. But in this, they have, because there is that rule set, the Immortals rule set, they have a progression to base it on. So they produce a lot more material about the various Immortals tied to the various clans and the various tribes and what have you. They have a section on NPCs, as is normal. They have a section on Totem Magic and how that interacts. One of the interesting things was, if you kill an animal that is your totem, it specifies that you don't gain XP, you lose XP that you would have gained from your character. So, say your spirit animal is a tiger, and you kill the tiger, and you normally would get XP for killing a tiger, because tigers are terrible. They're tough fights. Well, yeah, if you killed that tiger, you would have that XP subtracted from your XP because you killed your spirit animal. Things like that. They go into some details about the different totem powers. They're interesting. It's not super well sharply defined as a rule system, but I would say that if you were just running characters from this place, in this place, the totem rules are fairly useful. It becomes problematic when you start dealing with characters like, I'm from Erendi, or Thyatis, or someplace like that, and I'm running around with, one of these characters that have this, the totems and their spirit animal, and, how those things interact becomes a little more problematic, I think. But I like that he was trying to come up with a new thing, right? A new sort of rules set to work with, to make it feel different. And like I said, there are a lot of rules where it's like you don't get XP if you do this, or you get a different armor class if you're wearing leather and you're from this tribe because they wear this armor in a different way. You don't gain XP if you use a bow if you're from the horse tribes. Which I'm a little I get that they were trying to come up with limitations to sort of use the rules to help reinforce cultural assumptions, but their cultural assumption is a little weird. The notion that there would be horse riding clans that just don't use bows in war seems silly. But I guess they had to find a way of making them limited, and so they weren't, the super dominant thing. Another thing I noticed about this Gazetteer is, unlike its predecessors, it doesn't have a lot of wargame information. It just doesn't have it. Which is unusual. Most of them had at least some sort of, this is what you use these stats for, War Machine or what have you, battle system. It does include a single page of how to convert to second edition. But overall, it's mainly sort of world information with some rules to reinforce cultural assumptions for those characters, which D&D didn't do a whole lot of. So it was interesting to see that done here. And I mean, like, they would do it with the demi-human races, like elves get, longsword and bow, and that's the rules sort of support for an assumption that these are important weapons to elven culture, right? It's not that they have some sort of genetic propensity for shooting a bow, it's that this is a cultural thing. And you get that with the dwarves and sensing where you are in a dungeon or what have you, is a cultural thing. If you took a dwarf and he was born on a ship and was raised out in the islands, why would he know all this stuff that the dwarves get as a racial bonus? It's a cultural expectation. But the humans are assumed to sort of have a base thing, and they don't have the cultural expectation reinforcing the rules, but they do here. And I find that interesting. It's not good rules, to be honest. It's not great rules, but it's interesting to see that it's there. To see that attempt. As a broad exercise, I do like this Gazetteer. If only because it is an attempt to show a culture that doesn't get a lot of representation. The sort of Aboriginal American cultures are, don't get a lot of representation. They had a section in deities and demigods. I remember that when I was a kid. But beyond that, there wasn't a lot of other things where they do that with. So it was interesting to see them make an attempt. And I would like to see a modern redoing, a modern attempt. But, it's not without its problems. Specifically, the Tiger Clan is kind of an issue, because it basically paints the tribes that are largely from the Mexican and Central American areas as solely barbaric. And that's not a completely, let's say, nuanced view. And I get that they want to have an evil culture there. And I get that this isn't exactly the Aztecs or the Mayans. But it's certainly based on the Aztecs, and it certainly draws on that. And that's part of their assumptions here. The evil Aztec blood cultists is kind of a trope. There are blood sacrifices from that region among the Aztec culture. It's not unfounded, but it's not the only real truth to that culture. And here, it's pretty much presented as, this is an evil culture. This is how they think of you. This is how they deal with things. It's purely a death-oriented culture, warlike. How you die is the most important aspect. And they live and die at the whims of their high priests who do blood sacrifices all the time. It's clearly an evil culture. And they're just, basing it on the Aztecs in this regard. And not actually showing any of the nuances. So it's problematic in that regard. But that said, the art's solid. The book is reasonably well written. I saw a few minor typos and things like that. And I think that some of the rules to reinforce culture are ham-handed. Well-intended, but ham-handed. And probably should have gotten a little more review. But, I think it's worth a read. It's definitely worth a read. It's a good read. and it definitely would be a good addition as far as, bringing in interesting things into your game. Adding cultures that are not your standard fantasy game fare is definitely a good way to, change your game up. And this one definitely does that. It gives you lots of material to work from and lots of material to work with. I don't know that I would run it as written as far as rules go. If I were, running a D&D game now, I would definitely be like, yeah, you can use it for culture, but no, we're going to avoid all this very silly sort of, some of them get XP bonuses for this, and some of them lose XP for that, and that's a problem. It's problematic in how it's written, because it, not in a cultural sense, but that doesn't make a whole lot of rules sense. But overall, I liked it. I think as a capstone, it's fine. I will still be trying to get the box set, but the box sets are expensive, so it may be a while. But they, maybe they'll release it on the DM's Guild. They have announced that they are doing bounties now on products that are so long out of print that they don't have good copies to draw on. So they'll give you a bounty if you scan it and put it up, which I find it to be an interesting way of handling that problem. But so maybe it'll end up there someday. But until then, I'll be looking to get it in physical. I think I want it in physical anyway, just for my own personal collection. But it may be a while because I have other things that I need to spend money on, like student debt, medical bills, wacky things like that. But anyways, if you enjoyed this, subscribe, like, share with all the people. You might consider going over to the Patreon, which is where you can, kick in $1 or so if you like the content. I'm not going to judge you if you do or don't, but I figured I'd put it out there and maybe put in a little extra money to pay for the tools I use, or maybe someday helping me with getting, products so I can review them or what have you. But like I said, no judgment. If you're interested, awesome. If not, don't worry about it. But do share, do like, and have a good day. I'll be back tomorrow, and stay out of trouble. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying stay out of trouble. I'm talking to you. Yes.